The man from the Department of Defense stopped mid-sentence when he saw what was hanging from my lanyard. It wasn't my badge he was looking at. It was the coin. The old, worn challenge coin I'd clipped there 3 weeks earlier without thinking much about it, the one I'd found in my father's nightstand drawer, wrapped in a square of brown paper like something fragile. The man's face didn't change much. That was what unsettled me. He didn't gasp or stammer. He just went very still the way people do right before something important happens. His eyes stayed on it for 4 full seconds. I counted. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I said it was my father's. That he had passed away in April. The man looked up at me then. Not at my face exactly, but somewhere just past it, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "What was his name?" he asked. When I told him, he nodded once, slowly. Then he said, "I think we need to speak somewhere private." That was the moment I understood that my father, the man my entire family had written off as a disappointment, a drifter, a man who could never hold a job or commit to anything or explain himself when it mattered most, had been carrying something none of us had ever thought to ask about. My father's name was Dennis Carver. He was 61 years old when he died. He lived alone in a small rental house in Billings, Montana, the kind of place with 2 windows facing a gravel lot and a landlord who accepted cash. No television mounted on the wall, no photos on the shelves, just books, a folding table, and a coffee maker that had seen better years. My brother called the house a pigsty. My mother called it proof that he had never grown up. I called it quiet. I had always thought quiet was the truest thing about him. He was my father, and I was the only one of his 3 children who still returned his calls. My brother Marcus had stopped speaking to him after the divorce. That was 12 years ago. My sister Diane lived 40 minutes away and hadn't visited once in the last 4 years. She said she was busy. She was always busy when it came to him. My mother had remarried by the time I was in high school and had spent the years since referring to my father in the past tense, as though he had ceased to exist the moment she signed the papers. She wasn't cruel about it. She was simply done. I was never done with him. Even when he frustrated me, even when his answers were incomplete or deliberately vague, I kept showing up. We had dinner maybe 6 times a year. He always ordered black coffee and the cheapest thing on the menu and spent most of the meal asking about my work. I was a federal investigator with the Department of Homeland Security. He was proud of that in a way that embarrassed me, because the pride in his eyes always looked too large for the room. When I asked about his own past, he would smile and look out the window. "You know how it is," he would say. I didn't, but I stopped pushing, because the look that settled over his face whenever I pressed wasn't evasion. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes from a door you've held shut for decades. I found out he was sick from a neighbor, not my father himself. He called it some chest thing when I finally reached him and told me not to drive up, that he was handling it. He was in the hospital by the time I arrived. The nurse at the desk recognized my last name before I even finished saying it. "You're the daughter," she said. "You're the first family we've seen." He was thinner than I remembered. His hands, which had always been strong and deliberate, looked like they belonged to someone older. But he smiled when I walked in. It was the same smile he'd always had, the one that started in his eyes before his mouth caught up. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. I told him I wanted to. He slept most of that first day. I sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the monitors and called my brother and sister. Marcus said he would try to arrange something. Diane said she would call back. Neither of them came. My mother said, "Well, I hope he has good doctors," and changed the subject. My father died on a Tuesday morning in April. There was no dramatic final conversation. He simply slipped away between one breath and the next while I was sitting 3 feet away reading a book I couldn't remember afterward. The nurse said it was peaceful. I believed her. At the funeral, there were 11 people. A few of his neighbors. A retired postal worker who said my father used to shovel his driveway without being asked. A man about his age who sat in the back row and didn't introduce himself to anyone. My brother sent a flower arrangement with a card that said, "Rest easy." My sister did not send anything. My mother did not come. I was the one who arranged the burial. I paid for the headstone. I was the one who went back to the rental house afterward to sort through his belongings, because no one else offered and the landlord needed the unit back by end of month. Most of what I found was ordinary. Clothes folded neatly in the dresser. A small shelf of history books, dog-eared and annotated in his cramped handwriting. a toolbox in the closet that was better organized than anything else in the house. In the nightstand drawer, beneath a pocket Bible and a pharmacy receipt, wrapped in brown paper and a rubber band, I found the coin. It was heavy for its size. Brass or bronze, I couldn't tell. About the diameter of a $50. One side was smooth and plain. The other had a symbol I didn't recognize, not a military insignia I'd ever seen in my work. Not a unit patch. Not anything from the standard catalogs. Just a small geometric design. Angular and precise. The kind of thing that looked like it meant something specific to a very small number of people. I clipped it to my lanyard because it was his, and I wasn't ready to put it in a box. 3 weeks later, I was at a briefing in Washington. The man from the Department of Defense, his name was Harlan, no last name offered, saw it while I was pouring coffee in the hallway during the break. And that was how it started. He called me that evening from a number that showed up as private on my phone. He apologized for the brevity of their earlier exchange. He asked if I would be willing to meet somewhere less public. I said yes, because I was a federal investigator, and that particular instinct follow the thread was as automatic as breathing. We met 2 days later at a small office park in Virginia. Nondescript building, no signage, parking lot that was half empty at 10 in the morning. The woman at the front desk seemed to expect me. Harlan was waiting in a room that had no windows and no art on the walls and 2 chairs that faced each other across a narrow table. He had coffee ready. He said he wanted to be careful about what he shared, not to be obstructive, but because some of the relevant history remained in a complicated jurisdictional space. Those were his words. Complicated jurisdictional space. I said I understood. I did understand. I worked in federal bureaucracy. I knew that phrase. Your father served in the United States Army, he said. That much is documented. You probably knew that. I knew he'd been Army. Special Forces. He'd mentioned once or twice over the years. In the vague way he mentioned everything from that period of his life. The early 90s, mostly. Before I was born. He'd been in the service when my mother met him, and out of it by the time I was 3. What you likely didn't know, Harlan continued, is that there was a second chapter to his service. Informal, in the sense that it doesn't appear in any file that you or I can access through standard channels. He was recruited after his discharge for a series of roles that required someone with his particular background and profile. Deniable operations. The kind of work that requires a person to carry no documentation of what they're actually doing or why. I looked at the coin on the table between us. I had put it there when I sat down. That coin, he said, was issued to a very small group of individuals cleared for a specific program. I am not able to tell you the name of that program or the nature of the operations involved. What I can tell you is that I have not seen one of those coins in over 15 years. Most of them were recalled. A few were never returned. He paused. Your father kept his. I thought about how he always deflected when I asked about his past. I thought about the way he never owned property, never held a conventional career, never had a paper trail that amounted to much. My brother had once said he was financially irresponsible. My mother had called him someone who never committed to anything real. He wasn't running from responsibility, I said. No, Harlan agreed. He was maintaining a profile, one that required him to be unremarkable, uncomplicated, off the radar. He was invisible, I said. That was the job. I drove back to my apartment in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I kept both hands on the wheel and thought about every dinner we'd had together, every conversation where he'd smiled and redirected, every moment. I'd quietly wondered if he was hiding something ordinary, some embarrassment, some failure he didn't want to name. He hadn't been hiding failure. He had been protecting something I wasn't cleared to know. I called Marcus that night. I told him what I'd learned, or as much as I could summarize in a 10-minute phone call. There was a long silence on his end. Are you serious? He said. Yes, Ante. Another silence. So he wasn't just a deadbeat. I didn't respond to that. Look, Marcus said, even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that he was never there. He missed every single important thing. My graduation, my wedding. My kids barely knew who he was. He was there when he could be, I said. When he felt like it, Marcus said. He didn't always have a choice about where he was. Marcus got quiet again. Then, it's easy to say that now that he can't contradict it. He was right about one thing. My father had been absent, not just during the years of his covert work, but afterward too. in the way of a man who had spent so long not speaking that he had lost some of the language required for ordinary closeness. He didn't know how to show up to a birthday party and make small talk. He didn't know how to sit through a holiday dinner where people talked about real estate and television shows. He would get a look on his face at those gatherings, not boredom, exactly, but something like being underwater while everyone else breathed air. My mother had interpreted that as arrogance. My brother had interpreted it as indifference. I had always just thought it was grief of some kind, though I couldn't have said what he was grieving. Now I thought I understood. He was grieving the version of himself that could have explained, the version that could have said, "Here is what I've done and why I can't tell you." He didn't have that option. So he sat at the edge of rooms and watched his family slowly decide that he wasn't worth the space he was taking up. I started doing what investigators do. I looked for threads. I contacted a retired Army officer I'd worked a case with 2 years earlier, a man who knew people across multiple agencies and didn't ask unnecessary questions. I described the coin without showing him a photo. There was a pause on his end. "Where did you come across something like that?" he said. I told him it was a personal matter. He was quiet for a moment. "I've heard of that design," he said finally, "but only in the context of things I'm not supposed to have heard of, if you follow me." I followed him. "Those weren't distributed to soldiers," he said. "They were issued to people operating outside of formal military structure. Not contractors exactly, more like designated assets. People the government could use and, if necessary, lose without paperwork." "Lose," I repeated. "If an operation went sideways," he said carefully, "those individuals had no official connection to anyone. They were legally invisible." I thanked him and hung up and sat for a while with that word. Invisible. My father had been invisible by design. And then, when the work was done and the necessity was over, he had stayed invisible out of habit, or obligation, or because he didn't know how to be anything else. And the people who loved him, who should have loved him, had looked at his invisibility and decided it was a character flaw. I found 2 more people willing to talk through careful, indirect channels. One was a woman in her 70s who had worked as a civilian analyst during the period my father would have been most active. She didn't confirm anything directly, but she said something I wrote down. There were men in those years who were asked to disappear completely into their work. The ones who did it best never recovered. Not because they were broken, but because once you've been invisible for long enough, being seen feels dangerous. The second person was a retired special agent who had known my father personally. I tracked him down through an old address from a county record that had no obvious reason to be connected to my father but was, in a way, I still don't entirely understand. He agreed to meet in a diner in western Pennsylvania. He was in his late 60s, heavyset, with the posture of a man who had spent decades being careful in rooms. "Dennis was the best I ever worked alongside," he said, without me asking. "And I've worked alongside people who have files you'll never see." "What did he do?" I asked. "What needed doing?" he said. "In places that weren't on official maps, for reasons that will never be attributed to him or anyone connected to him." He looked at his coffee. He got people out. Intelligence assets, mostly. People who would have been killed if they were found. He ran extractions, quiet ones, the kind where no one could know an American had been there. "He saved lives," I said. "He saved a lot of lives," the man said. "And then he went home to Montana and nobody asked." My chest was tight in a way I didn't know how to explain. "Why didn't he get any recognition?" I asked. The man looked at me like that was a question from a different world. "Recognition would have required acknowledging the operations existed," he said, which they officially didn't, so neither did his part in them. I drove home from that diner and sat in my car outside my building for 30 minutes before I went inside. My brother called me 2 days later to tell me he had found a storage unit we hadn't known about. One my father had been paying for in cash, year after year, in a facility 20 miles outside of Billings. Marcus had found the key in an envelope tucked inside a cardboard box he'd taken from the rental house. He hadn't opened it. He was calling me because I had been the one making decisions. I drove back to Montana on a Friday. The storage unit was small, a 5x10 with a corrugated metal door. Inside were 2 boxes, a canvas duffel bag, and a flat metal lockbox with a combination lock. I knew the combination before I even consciously thought about it. My birthday, followed by the year my parents married. He had always remembered both. Inside the lockbox were photographs. Not many, maybe 30, taken over what looked like a span of 15 years. None of them were labeled. Most showed terrain I didn't recognize. Dense forest, urban alleyways in what could have been Eastern Europe, a mountain landscape that wasn't American. My father appeared in some of them, younger, leaner, with a look of focused calm I recognized at the dinner table. In several photos there were other people, most of their faces obscured or turned away as if by habit. In one of them, a man stood with my father in a narrow street, both of them in civilian clothes, both looking directly at the camera with the flat expression of people who understand photographs can be evidence. There was also a letter. It was in a sealed envelope at the bottom of the lockbox, marked with my name in his handwriting. Just my first name, no last name, as if he'd known exactly who would be the one to find it. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and opened it. He wrote that he had spent a long time deciding whether to leave anything behind. He said the rules he had agreed to, decades ago, had not technically expired. He said he had made peace with that. What he had not made peace with was the possibility that I would spend my life thinking he had simply failed at being present. He wrote, "I was present. I just couldn't tell you where." He wrote that the coin was the only thing he'd been given that he was allowed to keep, that he had kept it because it was the only proof he had that the years between his discharge and my birth had not been wasted, that he had done something, that the something had mattered. He wrote, "If someone who knows what it means ever asks you about it, you can tell them it was mine, that I earned it, and that I chose to trust you with it. That will be enough." I sat in that storage unit for a long time after I finished reading. Then I called my brother. And this time I didn't summarize. I read him every word. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him exhale, a long, shaky sound. "I told my kids he was a nobody," Marcus said. I didn't say anything. At Christmas one year I said I actually said it in front of everyone that the best thing he ever did for the family was leave. His voice was flat and hollow. "I said that in front of you. I said it in front of Mom." I remembered. I had been 17. "Marcus," I said. "He was in the room," Marcus said. "He heard it. He just looked at the table." "I called my sister after that," Diane cried. She said she had told herself for years that she stayed away because he had never made an effort, that the distance was mutual, that she wasn't to blame for a relationship he hadn't tried to maintain. She said that telling herself that had been much easier than asking why he was so quiet, why he never volunteered anything, why he seemed to accept the margins of their lives as though he expected to be placed there. "I thought he didn't care," she said. "He cared," I said. "He just couldn't explain why he was the way he was, so he let you fill in the blank." My mother was the hardest conversation. She had spent 20 years rewriting the story of their marriage as one about a man who had never truly shown up, who had been physically present for some of it and emotionally absent for all of it, who had chosen distance. When I told her what I had learned carefully, without sharing anything I'd been asked not to share, she was quiet for a long time. "He could have told me something," she finally said. "Not everything, just something. I would have understood." "He wasn't allowed to," I said. "He could have tried." "Mom," I said, and I tried to say it gently. He spent 15 years in situations where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person meant people died. He didn't know how to turn that off. He didn't know how to come home and decide what was safe to say and what wasn't. So he said nothing. Because nothing was the only thing he was sure wouldn't hurt anyone. She cried. It was the first time I had heard my mother cry since the funeral, and even then she had kept it contained, the way she kept most things contained. "I was so angry at him," she said. "I know. For so long. I know. Did he know I was angry?" I thought about the quiet way he'd accepted everything, the dinner table smile that never quite reached argument, the way he would let conversations go wherever they needed to go without defending himself. "I think he understood," I said. "I don't think he blamed you. My siblings and I arranged a second service for our father in June. Not a formal military ceremony, we weren't sure what we were allowed to request, and something about that felt wrong anyway. He had spent his life outside of official recognition. Putting him in a ceremony built around official recognition felt like misunderstanding him. Instead, we rented a small pavilion at a park in Billings. We reached out to the neighbors who had known him, to the retired postal worker who had spoken at the first service, To a few men from the VFW chapter in town who had known him peripherally. Harlan attended. He stood at the back and did not speak. But he was there, and that meant something I couldn't fully articulate. Marcus spoke. He talked about a camping trip he and our father had taken when he was 9. How our father had spent an entire afternoon teaching him to identify bird calls. He'd thought, at the time, that it was something every parent knew how to do. It was only recently that he'd realized it was something specific to this person. This quiet man who had spent years in wildernesses where knowing what was moving in the trees around you was a matter of survival. Diane brought a photograph she had found among her own things, a picture from her 7th birthday. Our father standing slightly apart from the group in the backyard, watching her open presents with an expression she had always read as disengagement. She said she had looked at that photograph 100 times over the years and interpreted the distance as indifference. But looking at it now, she saw something else. She saw a man watching his daughter's happiness with the intensity of someone storing it, deliberately, against a future in which he might not be there to see it. He was paying attention, she said. He was always paying attention. We just didn't know how to see it. My mother sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak. But at the end of the service, when most people had drifted toward the food and quiet conversation, she stood up and walked to the small table where we had placed his photograph, the coin, and a copy of the letter he had written to me. She stood there for a long time. I didn't go to her. Some things need their space. Harlan found me before he left. He shook my hand and said that, in his experience, the people who carried what my father had carried rarely received what they deserved in the way of acknowledgement. He said he was glad someone in the family had pressed for the truth. He deserved someone like you looking, he said. I told him I almost hadn't. That, for most of my life, I had accepted the version the family told itself. The one about a man who was simply ill-fitted for ordinary life, too strange, too closed off, too damaged in ways he wouldn't explain to be fully trusted. Most people accept that version, Harlan said. It's easier. It was easier. It had been easier for all of us, for a very long time, to decide that the silence meant emptiness. In the months after the second service, my family changed. Not all at once, not in the clean, satisfying way of a resolution wrapped in a bow. More like ice in April, slow, unpredictable, with cold days still arriving after warm ones. Marcus started asking his kids to call our father's photograph on the wall by his first name. Not the quiet man or grandpa we never really knew, just Dennis, like a person who deserved familiarity. Diane started volunteering at a veterans outreach center in her county. She said she didn't fully know why. I thought I knew why. She was looking for other quiet people, practicing the act of looking. My mother asked me, one afternoon over the phone, whether I thought he had been happy. It was the kind of question that had no clean answer. I told her I thought he had been at peace with what he had chosen, which was different from happy but not less meaningful. I keep thinking about the things I said, she said. Over the years. So do I said. How do you stop? I don't think you do, I said. I think you carry it, and you try to do something different with the next person who's hard to understand. She was quiet for a moment. That's what he would have said, she told me. Something like that? I believed her. I still have the coin. I wear it differently now, not on my lanyard but in my jacket pocket, where my hand sometimes finds it during long briefings when I need something solid. The metal is warm from years of being carried. It has the weight of an object that has meant many things to many people, none of those meanings written on its surface. I went back to the cemetery in Billings last September. Late afternoon, the light coming in low and gold across the grass. The headstone my siblings and I had chosen together was simple. His name, the years of his life, and 3 words I had suggested, and no one had argued with. He showed up. Not in the ways we expected, not in the ways we asked for, but in the only ways he was able to, given what he was carrying and what he had agreed to carry alone. I crouched down and placed the coin in the grass at the base of the stone. Not forever. Just for a minute. The way you set something down when you've been holding it long enough. For most of my life, I thought the loudest people were the bravest. I grew up in a family that measured effort by its visibility, love by its volume, sacrifice by whether it could be named at the dinner table. My father didn't fit any of those measurements, so we measured him wrong. He didn't live dramatically. He didn't die surrounded by people who understood him. He spent his last years in a small house in Montana with a second-hand coffee maker and a lockbox that nobody thought to ask about. He ate alone most nights, went to bed early, and woke up knowing that somewhere in the world there were people alive who didn't know his name. He thought that was enough. He had made peace with it being enough. I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if any of us could, but I think about it now when I'm in a room full of people talking loudly about their accomplishments, their titles, their visible contributions. I look for the person sitting at the edge, the one who listens more than they speak, the one whose face doesn't change when someone takes credit for something they should have shared. I look for my father. He's everywhere, once you know how to look. Men and women who carry weight that has no name and ask for nothing in return, and go home every night to places most people would drive past without noticing. People whose absence would be felt by strangers they've never met, in ways those strangers could never explain. My father was one of them. He spent his life being invisible so that other people could be safe. He made that choice before I was born, and he kept making it long after the formal obligation ended, because it had become the only shape he knew. I am still learning how to see him. I am still learning what it means to pay the kind of attention he deserved. But I am trying. And the coin is in my pocket. And I am his daughter. And that, as he once wrote, is enough. If you have listened to this story and felt something familiar in it, if there is someone in your life who sits at the edge of the room, who does not interrupt, who gives without accounting, please go to them, while you still can. Ask a question you haven't asked before. Sit with them without needing them to explain themselves, because the heaviest lives are often the quietest ones, and sometimes all they need is someone who stays long enough to notice the weight. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories about the people who hold the world up without being seen, we'll be here.